The biggest mistake you can make with this week's forecast is thinking one storm is coming. It's not. Something much bigger is happening across the U.S. The entire weather pattern is shifting, and over the next several days, that shift could bring dangerous heat, repeated severe thunderstorms, heavy rainfall, and flooding across multiple regions. But here's the part you really need to watch. The heat isn't simply going away, it's moving. And the storms may not just pass through once. They could keep reloading over the same areas day after day, turning repeated thunderstorms into a much bigger flooding and severe weather problem. Meanwhile, the West is still dealing with an ongoing wildfire crisis. And farther out, another signal is beginning to emerge in the Atlantic that could become important later next week. So this isn't one storm. It's a pattern capable of creating multiple threats across different parts of the country at the same time. And over the next few minutes, I'll show you where this pattern is moving, which areas could face the greatest risk, when conditions could become most dangerous, and what that developing Atlantic signal could mean. And let's start with what's driving this entire pattern. The key to understanding this forecast is what's happening high above the surface. Forecasters are watching two separate troughs becoming established on opposite sides of the continent, one over the Northeast Pacific and another near Hudson Bay in Canada. A trough is essentially a dip in the jet stream that encourages cooler, more unsettled air and helps guide weather systems along its edges. Normally, you might think of these as separate features, but when they're positioned like this at the same time, they help create a much broader corridor of unsettled weather between them, and that's where things get interesting. Meanwhile, the large ridge of high pressure that has been responsible for the extreme heat across the southwest is expected to weaken and shift eastward. That means the heat doesn't simply disappear, it gets displaced. As that ridge moves, the extreme heat threat begins expanding toward the central and southern plains and eventually farther east and southeast. And that creates a very unusual contrast. One part of the country is dealing with repeated thunderstorms and heavy rainfall, while another region is preparing for temperatures that could again push into dangerous territory. And that brings us to the first major change you need to know about. If you've been watching the extreme heat across the southwest, you might assume that once that ridge weakens, the danger is essentially over. But that's not necessarily what happens. The heat can relocate. As the ridge shifts eastward, hotter air can spread across parts of the central and southern plains and eventually into portions of the southeast. So the question isn't simply, when does the heat wave end? The more important question is, where does the heat go next? And that distinction matters, because areas that weren't dealing with the worst of the heat earlier in the week could suddenly find themselves underneath the same large-scale pattern. This is also one reason the severe weather setup becomes so interesting. You have very warm air and abundant moisture building in one part of the country, while disturbances and stronger winds are moving around the edges of that ridge. That creates the ingredients thunderstorms need. And over the next several days, those ingredients could repeatedly come together. The first part of the pattern is relatively straightforward. Storms begin developing across parts of the northern plains, Midwest, Great Lakes, and eventually farther east. The biggest concerns are damaging straight-line winds and large hail, with an isolated tornado threat possible depending on exactly how the low-level wind field develops. But here's the important part. Don't focus on one individual storm. The larger concern is the possibility of repeated rounds of storms. One storm system moves through, then another develops, then another. And instead of the atmosphere completely resetting between each event, moisture and instability can remain in place. That is what makes this pattern more difficult, because a forecast can look relatively manageable on one particular afternoon, while the overall week becomes much more significant. And that's exactly why the next part of the forecast deserves your attention. The severe thunderstorms are only half of the problem. The rainfall could eventually become the bigger concern. Forecasters are watching the potential for multi-day heavy rainfall across parts of the Ohio Valley and central Appalachians. And the phrase I want you to remember is multi-day. A single thunderstorm can produce heavy rain and then move away. But when thunderstorms repeatedly track across the same general region, rainfall begins accumulating faster than the ground can absorb it. If the soil is already saturated, the threshold for flooding becomes much lower. And that's where a normal summer thunderstorm pattern can turn into a genuine flash flood problem. This is particularly important because flooding doesn't always require one gigantic storm. Sometimes the danger comes from several rounds of heavy rain that simply don't give the ground enough time to recover. So while people may be watching the severe weather maps for tornadoes and damaging winds, the rainfall forecast could become just as important heading into early next week. And there's another reason the forecast becomes increasingly complicated from here. The severe weather threat isn't confined to one small area. The broader corridor being watched stretches from portions of the northern plains through the Midwest and Great Lakes and potentially toward the Northeast. But there's an important word here, uncertainty. That does not mean the threat is low. It means the atmosphere is complicated enough that forecasters aren't yet confident about exactly where each round of storms will organize. One day, the focus could be farther west. The next day, storms could shift east. And because individual thunderstorm complexes can influence the atmosphere around them, the location of one round can sometimes affect what happens with the next. That's why you shouldn't look at today's 7-day map and assume it tells you exactly which town will get hit 3 or 4 days from now. The broad pattern can be identified much earlier than the precise storm track. And that brings us to the most important day of the near-term forecast. As we move toward the weekend, the wind pattern begins changing. And that matters because thunderstorms don't just need heat, they need the right combination of instability, moisture, and wind shear. Think of instability as the fuel. Think of wind shear as the structure that helps a storm organize. When those ingredients overlap, thunderstorms can become much more organized than ordinary summer storms. That's why forecasters are paying particular attention to the period around the weekend and early next week. The potential exists for stronger storms to develop across parts of the upper Midwest and surrounding regions. That could mean damaging winds, large hail, and isolated tornadoes, depending on how the smaller scale details evolve. But I want to emphasize something important. Potential is not certainty. We're talking about a forecast that can still change significantly as the atmosphere gets closer to the event. So don't interpret an early outlook as a guarantee that a specific city will be hit. Instead, watch how the threat evolves. And that's exactly why the next few forecast updates will matter so much. Here's the easiest way to understand how this pattern could unfold. First comes the initial round of storms. Areas across the northern plains, Midwest, Great Lakes, and parts of the east can see thunderstorms develop, with damaging winds and hail among the primary concerns. Then comes a brief opportunity for the pattern to reorganize, but instead of shutting down completely, the larger atmospheric setup remains in place. Then comes the weekend. That's when stronger instability and changing wind profiles could increase the potential for more organized severe thunderstorms across portions of the upper Midwest and surrounding states. After that, the pattern shifts again. Early next week is where the rainfall threat becomes increasingly important. Repeated storms moving through parts of the Ohio Valley and central Appalachians could produce accumulating rainfall over multiple days. And once you start stacking storms on top of already wet ground, the flood risk can increase rapidly. But even then, the story isn't finished. Because while the central and eastern United States are becoming stormier, the West is dealing with an entirely different problem. The incoming storm pattern doesn't automatically solve the wildfire crisis across the Pacific Northwest and interior West. In fact, much of the western fire situation remains a separate weather story. That means you can have one part of the country dealing with heavy rain and severe thunderstorms, while another part is still dealing with extreme dryness, heat, and active wildfire conditions. And this is an important reminder about national weather patterns. The United States doesn't experience one single weather pattern at a time. Different regions can experience completely opposite extremes simultaneously. A family in the Ohio Valley might be watching a flood warning, while someone in the Pacific Northwest is watching a wildfire perimeter. And that's why looking at the national map as one single event can sometimes hide what's actually happening locally. But there's still another region we haven't talked about. And it's the one that could become increasingly interesting as we move deeper into August. The Atlantic tropics have been unusually quiet compared with what many people expect during this part of the season, but quiet doesn't mean permanently inactive. Forecasters are watching the possibility of tropical development later in the period, although the models aren't completely agreeing on what happens next. Some guidance has shown more interest in development, other guidance has backed away, and even if something manages to organize, there is another major obstacle: wind shear. Strong winds blowing in different directions at different levels of the atmosphere can disrupt the structure of a tropical system. That makes it harder for thunderstorms to remain organized around the center. So right now, this isn't a situation where you should assume a major hurricane is coming. It isn't. The important point is simply that the Atlantic is entering the part of the season when tropical activity deserves close monitoring. And if the atmospheric environment changes, the forecast could change with it. That's why this is a wild card, not a prediction. Now step back and look at what is happening. Extreme heat relocating eastward, repeated severe thunderstorms developing along a broad corridor, a multi-day rainfall threat emerging across the Ohio Valley and central Appalachians, potential flash flooding from repeated rounds of rain, a continued wildfire emergency across the West, and an Atlantic tropical pattern that remains quiet for now but deserves monitoring as conditions evolve. None of those things alone necessarily makes this an extraordinary week, but putting them together reveals the bigger story. The atmosphere is reorganizing, and that reorganization is producing completely different hazards across different parts of the country at almost the same time. That's why I don't want you to think about this as simply, that's too simple. The better way to think about it is, A large-scale pattern is changing, and each region is going to experience a different consequence of that change. So what should you actually watch over the next several days? If you're in the northern plains, Midwest, Great Lakes, or Northeast, pay close attention to local severe weather forecasts as each storm round gets closer. Don't rely on a 7-day map to tell you exactly what's going to happen in your neighborhood. The forecast will become more precise with time. If you're in the Ohio Valley or Central Appalachians, watch the rainfall totals and whether multiple rounds of storms begin targeting the same areas. That's where the flood threat could become more important. If you're in the central or southern plains and southeast, don't assume the weakening of the southwest heat wave means the heat threat is disappearing. The heat may simply be moving. If you're in the Pacific Northwest or interior west, don't let the national focus on storms and flooding make you forget that the wildfire threat remains active. And if you're along the Gulf or Atlantic coast, keep an eye on the tropics, but don't jump from a developing signal to a hurricane prediction. The forecast will evolve. And that's the biggest thing to remember about this entire setup. This isn't one storm, it's a pattern that can move the heat from one region to another, a pattern that can reload thunderstorms over several days, a pattern that can turn repeated rainfall into a flooding problem, a pattern that can leave the west dealing with wildfire danger while the east deals with storms, and a pattern that's complicated enough that even forecasters are still working to determine exactly where the strongest impacts will land. The broad signal is becoming clear, the details are not. And those details are exactly what we'll be watching over the next several days. Because the most important part of this forecast isn't simply knowing that severe weather or heavy rain is possible. It's knowing when the risk increases, where it shifts, and when the forecast changes. So if you're in one of these regions, keep checking your local forecast as we get closer. And if this breakdown helped you understand the bigger picture instead of just another isolated weather headline, subscribe and turn on notifications. I'll keep tracking how this pattern develops and where the highest risks ultimately set up. Stay safe, stay weather aware, and I'll see you in the next update.